All right, I have another interesting article that I want to go over in this video, titled The Hidden Memories of Plants Inside a Quiet Revolution in the Study of the World's Other Great Kingdom. Monica Gagliano began to study plant behavior because she was tired of killing animals. Now an evolutionary ecologist at the University of Western Australia in Perth, when she was a student and postdoc, she had been offing her research subjects at the end of experiments, the standard protocol for many animal studies. If she was to work on plants, she could just sample a leaf or a piece of root. When she switched her professional allegiance to plants, though, she brought with her some ideas from the animal world and soon began exploring questions few plant specialists probe: the possibilities of plant behavior, learning, and memory. In her first experiments with plant learning, Gagliano decided to test her new subjects the same way she would animals. She started with habituation, the simplest form of learning. If the plants encountered the same innocuous stimulus over and over again, would their response to it change? At the center of the experiment was the plant Mimosa pudica, which has a dramatic response to unfamiliar mechanical stimuli. Its leaves fold closed, perhaps to scare away eager herbivores. Using a specially designed rail, Gagliano introduced her M. pudica to a new experience. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I don't know. Someone can correct me if I'm not. Pudica? Pudica, maybe? We'll go with pudica. That just sounds better. She dropped them as if they were on a thrill ride in an amusement park for plants. The mimosa plants reacted. Their leaves shut tight, but as Gagliano repeated the stimulus, 7 sets of 60 drops each, all in one day, the plant's response changed. Soon, when they were dropped, they didn't react at all. It wasn't that they were worn out. When she shook them, they still shut their leaves tight. It was as if they knew that being dropped was nothing to freak out about. 3 days later, Gagliano came back to the lab and tested the same plants again. Down they went, and nothing. The plants were just as stoic as before. This was a surprise. In studies of animals such as bees, a memory that sticks for 24 hours is considered long-term. Gagliano wasn't expecting the plants to keep hold of the training days later. Then I went back 6 days later and it did it again, thinking surely now they forgot, she says. Instead, they remembered exactly as if they had just received the training. She waited a month and dropped them again. Their leaves stayed open. According to the rules that scientists routinely apply to animals, the mimosa plants had demonstrated that they could learn. In the study of the plant kingdom, a slow revolution is underway. Scientists are beginning to understand that plants have abilities, previously unnoticed and unimagined, that we've only ever associated with animals. In their own ways, plants can see, smell, feel, hear, and know where they are in the world. One recent study found that clusters of cells in plant embryos act a lot like brain cells and help the embryo to decide when to start growing. Of the possible plant talents that have gone under-recognized, memory is one of the most intriguing. Some plants live their whole lives in one season, while others grow for hundreds of years. Either way, it has not been obvious to us that any of them hold on to past events in ways that change how they react to new challenges. But biologists have shown that certain plants in certain situations can store information about their experiences and use that information to guide how they grow, develop, or behave. Functionally, at least, they appear to be creating memories. How, when, and why they form these memories might help scientists train plants to face the challenges, poor soil, drought, extreme heat, that are happening with increasing frequency and intensity. But first they have to understand, what does a plant remember? What is better to forget? Scientists have shied away from studying what might be called plant cognition, in part because of its association with pseudoscience, like the popular 1973 book, The Secret Life of Plants. Certain types of plant memories were mixed up, too, with discredited theories of evolution. One of the most well-understood forms of plant memory, for example, is vernalization, in which plants retain an impression of a long period of cold, which helps them determine the right time to produce flowers. These plants grow tall through the fall, brace themselves during winter, and bloom in the longer days of spring, but only if they have a memory of having gone through that winter. And then the article goes on to essentially discuss the history of scientific thought regarding plant memory. And I'm not going to read that whole section, I'm just going to skip to the bottom. Are plants secretly soaking up memories, flicking their epigenetic switches on and off in response to every significant stimulus they receive? It seems unlikely. Last year, a group of plant scientists based in Australia argued in the journal Science Advances that for plants, forgetting or not forming memories at all may be a more powerful tool for survival than memory, and that memory, in particular epigenetic memory, is likely a relatively rare event. Peter Crisp, the lead author of the paper, now at the University of Minnesota, makes it his job to stress plants out. He and his colleagues might stop watering plants and let them dry out before hydrating the thirsty plants and watching how they recover. It's been established that in certain plants, epigenetic memories of drought, along with other stressors such as low light and herbivory, can even make the leap across generations. So Crisp and his colleagues might do this for multiple generations. It gets interesting after 3, before testing if the plants remember the ordeal they've been through and become more tolerant of drought. We don't really see that, says Crisp. Plants, he points out, have incredible abilities to rebound from stressful conditions. In a paper published this summer, for instance, Crisp and his colleagues found that plants subjected to light stress rebounded rapidly. Just think how, with the right care, a neglected houseplant can bounce back from a wilted brown mess. Scientists have now reported plenty of examples of plant memory formation, but naturally they are less likely to publish results of experiments where plants could potentially form memories but don't. One of the biggest challenges of the field of study is even identifying whether a plant has formed a memory or not. When Crisp and his colleagues design lab studies, they have to control for any number of confounding factors to determine if any memories they observe are the result of the experimental stress. It's not as though the plant experiences something and says, "Oh, I remember this," says Stephen Eichen, Crisp's co-author from the Australian National University. It happens to have this chemical marker, a change at a molecular level. Identifying that change and attributing it to the experimental stress can be difficult. Even when scientists know a memory can form in one plant, they may not necessarily recognize it in another. Beet plants and wheat plants have their own molecular mechanisms of vernalization, which serve the same function but evolved independently. Identifying a true memory out in the field is significantly harder. In their experiments, however, Crisp and Eichen don't observe many plant memories being formed. What if, they ask, plant memory is rare simply because it's better for plants to forget? Having a memory, keeping track molecularly of signals that you've received in the past from your environment, does have a cost. Since we don't see memories all that often, maybe plants don't want to remember things all the time. Maybe it's better to put their energies elsewhere. Even when memories do form, they can fade. Another research group has shown, for example, that a plant might form an epigenetic memory of salt stress and pass it along across generations, but that if the stress fades, so does the memory. A plant that remembers too much might sacrifice healthy growth to be constantly on guard against drought, floods, salt, insects, etc. Better, perhaps, to let those negative experiences go instead of always preparing for the worst. It's inevitable that we try to understand plant memory and cognition through our own experience of the world. To an extent, even using the word memory is an evocative anthropic shorthand for what is actually going on in these plants. We use the term plant memory, but you could find other ways to describe it, says Eichen, but semi-heritable chromatin factors doesn't have quite the same legibility. Sometimes I have to try to explain my work to my mom and you say, well, maybe it's like a memory. Even if you think about human memories, it's still kind of an abstract thing, right? You can think about neural connections, but often in common dialogue, when you think of memory, you know what a memory is. At that level, maybe you don't care about where it's coming from or what specific neurons are tied to it. That's closer to the position from which Gagliano, the ecologist, approaches plant memory. Unlike the molecular geneticist, she's less interested in the specific mechanisms of memory formation than she is in the process of learning itself. Of course plants can remember, she says. I know that behaviorally a plant will exhibit a change in behavior that is predictable. If condition A is met, then the plant should be able to do X. So by being able to do X, it means that the plant has to remember what happened before. Otherwise, it wouldn't be able to do X. The leaf-closing M. pudica isn't the only plant that Gagliano can teach new tricks. In another experiment, she grew garden pea plants in a Y-shaped maze and tested whether they could learn to associate different cues, wind, and light. Plants gravitate toward light, and in the experiment, Gagliano added an additional cue, airflow produced by a fan. For some of the plants, light and air flowed from the same side of the Y shape. For others, light and air came from different directions. With the peas, I turned the dial up, she says. Not only did the pea need to learn something, but he learned something that meant nothing, that was totally irrelevant. Mimosa had to follow just one experience, the drop. What does this mean? While the pea had to follow two events occurring, the fan and the lights. That was a weird sentence. After training the plants, Gagliano withheld the light. When she next turned on the fans, she had switched them to the opposite branch of the Y shape. She wanted to see if the plants had learned to associate airflow with light, or its absence, strongly enough to react to the breeze, even if it was coming from a different direction with no light as a signal. It worked. The plants that had been trained to associate the two stimuli grew toward the fan. The plants that had been taught to separate them grew away from the airflow. In that context, memory is actually not the interesting bit. Of course you have memory, otherwise you wouldn't be able to do the trick, she says. Memory is part of the learning process, but who is doing the learning? What is actually happening? Who is it that is actually making the association between fan and light? It's telling that Gagliano uses the word who. Well, that was tripping me up when she was referring to the plants as he. It's telling that Gagliano uses the word who, which many people would be unlikely to apply to plants. Even though they're alive, we tend to think of plants as objects rather than dynamic, breathing, growing beings. We see them as mechanistic things that react to simple stimuli. This has a direct relevance to my daily life, and is part of the reason that I'm so interested in this subject. Specifically, that being the fact that my slave job involves me interacting with plants on a daily basis. Just a couple days ago, I was harvesting Brussels sprouts, and as a part of that process, you're just ripping the leaves off the plants like it's no big deal, and you just get in this mindset where you're trying to get the weight that you need, and I'm just sitting there ripping these leaves off and picking off the Brussels sprouts and just going about it in a mindless fashion, not realizing that I'm obliterating a sentient plant here, that we should be harvesting these plants and treating them the same way that you would treat any other form of life that you are taking or manipulating in any way. But anyway, getting back to the article here. But to some extent, that's true of every type of life on Earth. Everything that lives is a bundle of chemicals and electrical signals in dialogue with the environment in which it exists. A memory, such as of the heat of summer on last year's beach vacation, is a biochemical marker registered from a set of external inputs. A plant's epigenetic memory of the cold of winter months on a fundamental level is not so different. And so, really interesting article they got into this study on plant memory. And speaking of which, here's another article. This was just discussing the same study. And she kind of summed up what she was getting at, which is, we like to think because we have such big brains, we're exceptional. Our trillions of neurons are keys to memory, feelings, consciousness. Brainless creatures, by definition, can't do what we do. So, of course, plants can't remember. But Gagliano says maybe they can. What we have shown here, she says at the end of her paper, leads to one clear, albeit quite different conclusion. The process of remembering may not require the conventional neural networks and pathways of animals. Brains and neurons are just one possible, undeniably sophisticated solution, but they may not be a necessary requirement for learning. And who knows, maybe she just found the plant that will one day prove her right. And yeah, that's what her study showed, is that this plant obviously had the capability to learn, as well as the study on the pea plants, that clearly there's a sentience going on here where these plants have the ability to learn based on various stimuli. It's just they have a different scale of perception than we do. And this is a self-evident fact for anyone that has walked barefoot through a forest, and eventually you come into a resonance with your surrounding environment because your body is sort of tuning in to the different scale of existence that the plants exist in. Plants are able to assess their environment by analyzing light. and are able to remember quote unquote light they have experienced recently. So in many ways, plants are the true light workers, right? They're light beings. By analyzing chemical reactions in leaves, scientists have come to appreciate that plants possess a kind of intelligence. BBC News has a terrific story on a group of researchers who believe they have found the plant equivalent of the nervous system, which functions by translating light into chemical reactions and remembering those reactions over time. Well, right, I mean, plants already do this through photosynthesis. This is how they sustain themselves, but this is talking about the way that their sentience interacts with light even above what the mainstream scientists would refer to as the mundane process of photosynthesis, where the plants just feed themselves. Plants need to analyze and remember different wavelengths of light in order to prepare for seasonal variations in pests and pathogens in the air. What was even more peculiar, Professor Karpinski said, was that the plant's responses changed depending on the color of the light that was being shown on them. There were characteristic changes for red, blue, and white light. He explained now that this is really fascinating. Before going further, obviously we have our own ability to absorb light wavelengths as evidenced by our ability to absorb sunlight in the same way that plants absorb sunlight. So it's so obvious then, by extension, that the light coming out of the television and the computer and phone screens will have a dramatic impact on us if we are exposed to it for long periods of time over many years. And you can see why that would be such an efficient and effective method of mind control if you could embed that light with certain images subliminally or just with certain frequencies sonically that would combine to have an effect on our perception. And this, the plants, which are even more light focused than we are, well, maybe we've just forgot that we are supposed to be just as light focused as they are, and we're sort of in a trance, as it were. He suspected that plants might use the information encoded in the light to stimulate protective chemical reactions. He and his colleagues examined this more closely by looking at the effect of different colors of light on the plant's immunity to disease. When we shone the light on the plant for 1 hour and then infected it with a virus or with bacteria, 24 hours after that light exposure, it resisted the infection, he explained. Very interesting. But when we infected the plant before shining the light, it could not build up resistance. So the plant has a specific memory for the light, which builds its immunity against pathogens, and it can adjust to varying light conditions. He said that plants used information encrypted in the light to immunize themselves against seasonal pathogens. Every day or week of the season has a characteristic light quality. Very interesting, Professor Karpinski explained. So the plants perform a sort of biological light computation using information contained in the light to immunize themselves against diseases that are prevalent during that season. That is amazing. Professor Christine Foyer, a plant scientist from the University of Leeds, said the study took our thinking one step forward. Plants have to survive stresses such as drought or cold and live through it and keep growing, she told BBC News. This requires an appraisal of the situation and an appropriate response. That's a form of intelligence. And then this is an article that was discussing the same Gaglione study on the Mimosa pudica. And there was just a really interesting passage here that says, while behavior may seem an odd word to use, the undisputed fact is that plants do respond to stimuli, albeit often very slowly over the course of hours, days, or weeks. This makes it easy to feel like nothing is going on with them. Still, as Poland points out, a race of aliens living in a radically sped up dimension of time arrive on Earth and, unable to detect any movement in humans, come to the logical conclusion that we are inert material with which they may do as they please. The aliens proceed ruthlessly to exploit us, and that's a really an interesting way to put it, right? I mean, but yeah, that's really fascinating, it's just a way to view scalar perception and how, yeah, that's basically how we're viewing plants just because they're on a different scale of existence, a different scale of perception. And as a result, time to them is different than our perception of time. And it could be to the point where we view them as this inert material, as this says, just because we can't view their movements as rapidly as it is taking place on their scale of perception. And you can see this right in any of the videos they do on time-lapse photography where they show a plant growing, and it's just when they time-lapse it, it's like this rapid, amazing thing that's taking place in the within the larger plant community, all these things growing. And if you viewed it on their scale, it might be just as real time as our current experience in the way that you're listening to me speak right now. And after you're done, we'll go about your daily life as if everything's normal. And along those lines, this is kind of getting at this little passage that I just read. Is I'm sure most of you have heard that the studies that have been done on grass now say that the smell of freshly cut grass is actually a plant distress call. And that really gets at that passage about, aliens that would view us as inert material. If they were on a different scale and passage of time for them was much slower than it is for us, well, they would, or even faster, however you want to view it, they would view us as just these things that can be cut like grass. It's just, people just go about their daily lives, and that's such a ridiculous thing. It makes me think of, there was that show Weeds a long time ago, or not a long time ago, but it seems like a long time ago now. And the intro to it, that was, it had the song that was talking about little boxes made of ticky tack, just a critique of the suburbs and suburban life and the insanity of lawn care and landscaping in general. It goes back to the whole order out of chaos thing, right? Like taking control over nature, ordering the chaos of nature. Oh, it's so crazy. Somebody's cutting their grass outside as I said that. That's funny. Or somebody's landscaping. I don't know, one of the two. Okay. The lovely scent of grass is the reek of plant anguish. When attacked, plants release airborne chemical compounds. Now scientists say plants can use these compounds almost like language, notifying nearby creatures who can rescue them from insect attacks. A group of German scientists studying a wild tobacco plant noticed that the compounds it released, called green leaf volatiles or GLVs, were very specific. When the plants were infested by caterpillars, the plants released a distress GLV that attracted predatory bugs who'd like to eat the caterpillars in question. And then this was another article, that fresh cut grass smell is a distress signal. It's just kind of disturbing, right? Because it goes back to what I was saying about how when I'm out there harvesting plants or, picking its fruit, it's like I'm totally lost in this world of business, and being lost in that perception, I lose sight of the fact that I'm dealing with a sentient creature. And really, it's no different than what's happened in the large-scale agricultural business where, whether it's animals or crops, especially with the animals in factory farms, the business of it has made everyone lose touch with the fact that we're dealing with sentient creatures here. And I hopefully viewing it from the angle of cutting your own grass and how that is actually, it smells good in the same way that the food tastes good, but it's a distress signal, that smell of the cut grass, because you're cutting a living sentient thing, and it's responding to that. And it's just a very useful and beneficial mentality to always keep in the back of your mind as you go about your daily routine. And I'm just as guilty as everybody else of falling out of that just to the regular, or due to the regular stresses of this world and this society that we all have to interact with. Trauma, that's what. It's the smell of chemical defenses and first aid. The fresh green, quote unquote, scent of a just mowed lawn is the lawn trying to save itself from the injury you just inflicted. It really just makes you think, the level of awareness and just general state of mind that must have existed at one time in this reality is just so different from where we're currently at. Just the symbiosis that should exist between us and the environment is has been totally broken. We're so disconnected from it. Chopping down trees. I mean, just think, going back to plant memory, think about like the redwoods in California, trees that are hundreds of years old. Think about the wisdom and knowledge that those trees have, you know. And then, of course, we can't talk about all this without talking about what Terence McKenna talked about. And this article is Are Mushrooms from Outer Space? Of course, this is what McKenna always postulated. And I'm just going to read a little bit about it, just in case you haven't come across that information. Modern day scientists say that mushrooms are more closely related to animals than plants. The primary reasons being they breathe oxygen and exhale carbon dioxide like humans. I mean, time out, record, screech, halt. Let me read that again. Modern day scientists say that mushrooms are more closely related to animals than plants. The primary reasons being they breathe oxygen and exhale carbon dioxide like humans. What? That's amazing. Rather than the reverse in the plant world. And mushrooms contain no chlorophyll. The late ethnobotanist Terence McKenna suggested that mushrooms are responsible for human intelligence as we know it. His theory hypothesized that mushroom spores possess all the necessary requirements to travel on space currents. Furthermore, they could have settled in the brain matter of primitive humanoids and, following the lines of modern-day hallucinogenic mushrooms, directly contributed to our modern-day intelligence and self-awareness. McKenna went on to theorize that mushrooms are the reason there is human life on Earth. While this may seem like material from a science fiction novel, there is no avoiding the fact that mushrooms possess many traits that are unique to their kingdom alone. Fungi build cell walls out of chitin, the same material that makes up the hard outer shells of insects and other arthropods. These cell walls contain similar chemicals found in butterfly and beetle wings, as well as the plumage of some colorful birds, such as peacocks. Living spores have been found and collected in every level of Earth's atmosphere. Mushroom spores are electron dense and can survive in the vacuum of space. And this is why McKenna would always hypothesize that. And he kind of did it in a joking way, but I mean, hey, like, yeah, they could have traveled, they would, in a sense, be alien. Additionally, their outer layer is actually metallic and of a purple hue, which naturally allows the spore to deflect ultraviolet light. And as if all this wasn't unique enough, the outer shell of the spore is the hardest organic compound to exist in nature, as if it were designed to travel in space, if space even exists as we are told it exists. I mean, who knows what it actually is? I have no idea, and I would not pretend to know, but, you know, it could be water up there for all we know. It could be some sort of like water-dense material that these spores are capable of traveling through. Who knows? And then the last one here is the Wood Wide Web. This is how mushrooms invented the internet. And, you know, I've alluded to this in prior recordings about how, yeah, they most likely got the internet from studying mycelium. And so I'll just read a little bit of this. Fascinating new research has revealed that we're not the only species that use an internet to communicate, and this really kind of ties everything together. Plants may seem like they don't do much from day to day, but they are actually able to send and receive complex communications from one another using something called mycelium, which is what mycologist Paul Stamets calls the internet of the natural world. When we think of fungi, we usually think of mushrooms, but mushrooms are only the fruiting body of organisms called mycelia. Mycelium, plural, look like white hairy threads just under the surface of the forest floor, or your wood chip pile. You may not be able to see mycelium at all, since it's often just a single cell thick. In about 8 cubic inches of healthy forest floor, there is as much as 300 miles of mycelium running through it like a tangled, complex, finely spun web. Now, I don't know how they could possibly approximate that there's 300 miles of it, but anyway, that's just something that they say. Just like they say, you know, oh, there's 7 billion people on the planet. Yeah, okay, sure thing, buddy. but that's a subject for another video. If a particular plant is being ravaged by insects, it can send hormone-like messengers through the mycelium to its neighboring plants, and they will send out defensive mechanisms to avoid getting munched on themselves. What's more, plants can share nutrients, minerals, and even water resources amongst themselves because the mycelium can transmit these things between herbs, grasses, and even massive trees that may be miles apart from each other. Mycelium also contains an acid which breaks down rocks, thereby making minerals available in the soil. Fungi are becoming recognized as gateway species, crucial to the development of healthy ecosystems. Mycological action even boosts the bioavailability of other soil nutrients and converts soil toxins into usable resources for all plants. Yeah, just incredible. I mean, I hope it's obvious from what we've gone over that, yes, of course, plants are sentient. They have an intelligence. They have a whole network of communication that we're just totally disconnected from. And of course, it's by design. And part of regaining your ability to have intuition and see the truth is taking steps to reconnect yourself into that wood wide web, as it were. Because that's when the answers really flow to you. That's when you become open to the answers. Because like I was saying earlier, potentially about like redwood trees, for example, or rainforests that are so many hundreds of or even thousands of years old, there's so much accumulated knowledge, and those trees haven't been manipulated like human beings have potentially been manipulated, or other animals have potentially been genetically manipulated. So they carry information that you can then have access to, and that's when answers that you're searching for can really present themselves. It's amazing. And you know, part of me making this video is that I lose sight of it myself all the time. So now I'll have my own record that I can go back to and say, oh yeah, you're really disconnected from what you should be thinking and doing. And I really do need the reminder because of the job that I have. You know, it's so easy to become disconnected in that way. So that's all for now, and talk to you guys in a little bit.
We're not torturing worms, Sophie. If you're interested, we're modifying organisms. In this case, they happen to be worms that are blind, and we're modifying them to have vision.
You can make blind worms see?
Kinda. I mean, we can now. Maybe.
You think that's a good idea?
Do you think it's a bad idea?
I think it's dangerous to play God.
Sophie, I believe in proof. There is no proof that there is some magical spirit that's invisible, living above us, right on top of us.
How many senses do worms have?
They have two: smell and touch. Why?
So they live without any ability to see or even know about light, right? The notion of light to them is unimaginable.
Yeah.
But we humans, we know that light exists all around them, right on top of them. They cannot sense it, but with a little mutation, they do, right?
Correct.
So, after perhaps some humans, rare humans, have mutated to have another sense, a spirit sense, and can perceive a world that is right on top of us, everywhere. Just like the light on these worms.